On today's episode of the Queen's Return on Innovation podcast, we're thrilled to have Steph Smith with us, a Queen's grad in chemical engineering from 2015. Steph is a marketer, a writer, a podcaster who's worked in consulting and with companies you may have heard of like The Hustle and HubSpot, and is currently a podcast host at Andreessen Horowitz. She's also the author of a book doing content right and has had multiple projects reach #1 on Product Hunt. So join us as we dive into her journey from Queen's University to consulting to becoming a content creator. Steph, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
It's great to be here, and this is such a throwback, but it's also making me feel so old because it's been a while since I graduated.
Well, let's jump into it. And in our preamble with some show notes going back and forth by email, what struck me, Steph, I think would be of interest to our listeners is just how much you've been the CEO of your own career. So to start off with, could you walk us through how you go from graduating from Queen's in chemical engineering to consulting to becoming a creator to now being a podcast host at Andreessen Horowitz, one of the preeminent Silicon Valley venture capital firms?
Sure. So, I love your framing this idea of being the CEO, really directing your life and not just letting perhaps the degree that you happen to take or even the first job that you took out of school being the definitive answer to what you're going to do for, what can be decades to come. And so, what's funny in reflecting on the many different paths I have taken since is that there were a few instances while at Queen's and also right after Queen's that really influenced that. So I'll just share two of them. The first was I happened to go on exchange in third year while I was at Queen's, but I was in engineering, as you said, and fewer engineering students, at least when I was there, happened to go on exchange. That was really a function of being able to find the right courses at the time so that you could still graduate on time. But I remember not really hearing much about it, but stumbling upon, I think, someone a year older than me who happened to go to Lund, which is where I went on exchange. And I had actually missed the deadline for applying to exchange. And I can't remember who I reached out to, but I sent them an email and I was just like, I'm so sorry. I've totally missed the deadline. I didn't know we could do this. Is there any chance I can still participate? And that person very kindly offered me the chance to still go on exchange. And I think that was one of those cases where, when you're young, you don't realize that the world isn't binary. You can ask for your chance at something. You can push for something that maybe you haven't heard of or you didn't even know is possible. And that sounds really simple, but exchange for me ended up being this event, you could say, this before and after, where after I realized, oh wow, this was a whole new world that I wasn't exposed to before, and all it took to be exposed to it was asking. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, which ties directly into exchange, was after I graduated. You have that 4-month period. Some people jump right into work. I happened to have a job set up in September. So I had 4 months and I went traveling. A lot of people do this. I went to Southeast Asia. I went to Australia. I went to Europe. I literally did a whole world adventure because I had this idea in my head that after that 4-month adventure, my life was set for me. As in, I'd go into consulting and I'd be doing that for decades to come. And I would max have 2 weeks off a year to go and adventure and play. And I remember being in a hostel actually at the end of that trip talking to the friend who I was traveling with, and we were just so sad about that concept. We were just like, oh, I guess what we think of life today as we know it is over. And I'm mentioning these two cases, the exchange and then that realization, because that second realization was so far from the truth. But it did guide me towards, over the next year, trying to find a remote job. And through that exercise, I just kind of realized that I actually am in control. So coming back to your idea of being the CEO of your own career, I slowly but surely started, taking back the reins. And I was like, oh no, I actually don't have to just succumb to 40 years in consulting for the rest of my life. I can actually travel and work, which is what I wanted to do. I can work remotely and have flexible hours. I can, go from consulting into technology. I can get a job on a growth team, even though that's not my expertise per se. I'm okay to give up engineering, at least for the time being, or maybe forever, even though all my classmates are, diving headfirst into that. And so coming back to answering your question, I think over time, I've built up the reps where I have, as I mentioned before, taken back the reins and pushed for things that I wanted and taken chances. And I've been rewarded for that over time. And then that has, naturally led me to experiences I never would have imagined, like being, part of Andreessen Horowitz as their podcast host. Would have never guessed that at Queen's back in the day.
It's a very interesting career trajectory for sure. And I think a good message, because there is some trepidation that as students are graduating, and just as you've said, I've locked myself into this career path forever. Is this something I'm truly passionate about? Is this something I want to picture myself doing for the next 35 years? Doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and I think is less so as people move forward. And so, Steph, I know in your various postings online, you've talked about how you started dabbling in side projects, and you've mentioned how you started looking for remote work. But talk to us about some of the side projects you did and how those shape some of the skill sets that moved you down the path from consultant to marketer and creator in some of the high growth companies you've worked with.
Yeah. And just a quick note on this idea of experimentation. And to your point, many of the projects I did ended up not just benefiting me through their existence, but through the path and in gaining skills to be able to create them. And along that thread, over the last few years, as I've pursued these different side projects or jobs that I never expected to have, they've opened new doors where I'm like, I didn't realize that it was so important to learn to code. Let me go do this. Once I've done this, now there's these new doors that open up. And so coming back to your question about what skills they've unlocked, I'll just quickly mention a few of the side projects. You mentioned some at the outset, but I wrote a book, which I never expected to do, about content. I, at one point, decided that I just needed to learn to code. And that came from living in Bali for a while. And around that time in Canggu specifically, there was a large swath, or you could say cohort, of indie makers. These are people who would create, you could say, projects, products, or ultimately companies that made money online through code mostly. And these people would just run everything themselves. I think the most well-known person in this space is someone named Peter Levels, who is truly an independent entrepreneur. He has several companies he's created, and he runs all of it by himself, with the exception of a few part-time contractors. So I was really inspired at this time to be like, wow, again, like this world exists that I didn't know about, certainly in college and even for years after, where I can kind of like determine my own destiny, but also run it. I can run these companies all by myself. I can make all these decisions. I don't have to lead, a big team of 20 people, which, by the way, shortly after leaving Queens, I happened to be running a team of 20 people, I think at the age of 23. So I got that experience pretty early on. Wow. And, under with the lens of trying and experimenting, I think I was very lucky to learn that was actually not something that I loved doing. Anyway, so I'd been exposed to all these amazing people, and I decided in order for me to be able to do some of the things that they're doing, I needed to learn to code. So that's one example of where I forged down that path. I spent the next 9 months or so where my primary goal, I was still working full time, but outside of that job was to learn to code. And every day I would mark down, did I actually spend time on this, as in learning to code or not? I took this full stack Udemy course. And then at the end of that course, as part of the 9 months, it was my job to be like, okay, I'm not just going to forget this stuff. I'm just going to create as many side projects, whether they're meaningful or not, whether I think they'll make money or not. I'm just going to cement this knowledge. And those were many of the projects that ended up, going to number one on Product Hunt. There was one called Unoya, which was this fun directory of untranslatable words. There was another few that, again, they were not really products or companies. They were just things that I wanted to exist in the world. And then years later, I ended up writing a book. But all of that is to say that, now some of those projects have made some money. Like the book has done hundreds of thousands of dollars worth in sales. But I think the biggest value that came out of all of those projects was not any sort of money. It was, to your point, the skills. Where now I've never felt more financially stable, not because of the actual financial picture that I have, but because now I actually feel like I have this toolkit of skills, whether it's writing, whether it's coding, whether it's design, marketing, that now I feel like even if any job was stripped from me or all my side projects were taken away, I would still be able to create something with my own bare hands and brain from scratch. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think those side projects, if anything, I wish I pursued earlier, like when I was a student at Queen's.
Absolutely answers the question for sure. As much as students lament the idea of writing term papers and things like that, they are important skills. And I know you've got a podcast with your partner called, I'll just say they don't teach you in school, where I assume there's a bunch of things that are soft skills that, if you look at a normal distribution, and if you're writing and you can communicate a little bit farther to the left on that normal distribution, you're probably going to have things open up. And in the world of business, whether you're entrepreneurial, working as a creator, or working at a big company, being a savvy, effective communicator, being able to present well, is an important skill that you can translate into many different areas. You've talked about some of the things you probably learned at Queen's, like design thinking and the engineering concepts and whatnot, but taking those frameworks, the next step, it really is helpful. And I'm assuming in pursuing those side projects, you strike me as sort of a curious person, where you just said, well, this looks like an interesting need. Let's see if I can spin up a little widget or a project online that will answer this question. These don't have to be grand projects necessarily, right? They can be little tiny bits that even, I guess Paul Graham from Y Combinator says initially, in the startup world, at least, you need to do things that don't scale. So I don't think students thinking of graduating or thinking about side hustles really need to say, I need to invent the next Facebook now. It can be pretty niche and pretty small, right?
Yeah, and I think that's actually so important, because back when I was at Queen's, I did have a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit. I remember talking to this friend of mine, Eric, and we were both like, we'd follow Y Combinator, we'd follow people like Paul Graham, and we were like, we need to come up with our next startup idea. And we'd literally sit down and we'd, send each other 3 startup ideas every day. But they were so far removed from what we were actually interested in, because we were trying to think from the lens of what startups we had seen and what we thought the market wanted, instead of what truly we were curious about. And I think, this actually relates to even how much of what students learn in the classroom is, to your point, extremely valuable. But if they can't tie that back to something that they're curious and excited about, that's when that knowledge becomes really, really transient, even if it's important. And just to give an example of this, I did take coding classes at Queen's, and I did learn that material, not to the extent that I know now, but, I would learn MATLAB and I would, get good grades in that course. But because at the time I couldn't tie it back to something that I was excited to build, even if it was a silly website of untranslatable words, then again, that knowledge became really, really transient. And also the process of learning that knowledge became all the more grueling and unexciting. I'll give one other example of this, not from Queen's, but my least favorite course in high school and really throughout my whole education experience was English class. And I think many people resonate with that, where they find writing truly exhausting. And that's mostly because I think a lot of people are taught how to write, and there's merit to that. They're taught how to write an essay, for example, in high school, and how it has to have 3 key points, and they're really taught more about structure than getting a point across. And again, getting a point across that they're excited to say. And so what's been fascinating for me since I've left school is I now love writing. I write truly for fun, and that's actually, you could say, a lot of people come to me because of my writing. That was how I kind of initially built my following of sorts. And it's been amazing to see that transition in my own brain. And I think that applies to many skills outside of writing. It's just, again, asking the questions, A, how do I learn this in a way where it relates to my life or my curiosities so that I actually want to engage? And then as you start doing that, B, you end up actually pursuing it in a way that's much, much more long-term, because you want to revisit it. It's helping you facilitate a goal. And over time, all of a sudden you, like me, become someone that actually considers themselves a writer who used to hate writing back in the day.
Yeah, and effective writing can be so important. And you started to touch on another point I'd love to chat with you about, Steph, and that is the paradigm in school, university, college, whatever it is. Students are evaluated based on the curriculum, the course materials, and that's typically examinations where you're asked a question and you give the right answer and you get a grade. When you move into the real world, and if you're interested in trying to either build an audience or look to decide, say you worked at a big multinational software company to see if this feature should be developed, in the world past post-secondary education, it's actually almost not as much about what the answers are. It's asking the right question. And so can you talk to us about how you've using the tools and the data that's online to help in your career? And I guess I'm thinking here your time at The Hustle and other places where newsletters really need to have subject matter that audiences are interested in engaging in, so that while you're honing the writing craft and the skills, you're actually writing and delivering content that people will find interesting and engaging.
Yeah, and I think one thing you touched on there is that in many cases, once you leave school, there is not a right answer. And using newsletters as an example of that, there are, I don't know if it's thousands or millions of newsletters out there. There are many that are successful. There are even more that are unsuccessful. And so coming to this idea of there is not a right answer, there are many wrong answers and there are many right answers, versus in school, you often are looking for a correct answer. And also, by the way, that's why I think I had a really great short-term memory. So I think I excelled in school, but many people don't have that same brain architecture, you could say. But what's exciting is that once you leave school, it's much more about problem solving. It's much more about, as you're saying, not answering the right questions. It's about asking the right questions. And my time at The Hustle, I was building a product called Trends. And it was all about finding trends either as they're in their early stages or really before people have heard of them. And so that could be anything from looking at data sources like Google Trends, where you can just see what are people searching for, because Google Trends or really any Google search data is such a unique data source where billions of people are querying every day. And the equivalent of a query, what you type into Google, is basically telling Google what you care about, what you want in life, the questions that you're asking. And if you aggregate that en masse, you can learn a lot about the world. Let me give you an example. When I was looking for remote work back in the day, I happened to look it up in Google Trends, and what you could see, and you can still see this, by the way, in the archive, of course, because it doesn't change, is you could see remote work peaking at the end of every year, right as people were writing New Year's resolutions. You could see them searching for remote jobs. You could see as they were re-querying their own life and thinking through, what do I want? Do I want more flexibility? Do I want to be able to travel? Do I want something new in my life? Remote work was coming up. And so again, as you're looking through data, or as you're almost like querying your own life, you can abstract that to other data and see, is this a wider trend? And that was the kind of work that we were doing. We would do anything from looking up the skincare ingredients that were trending, on subreddits, to finding different products like hard kombucha that was trending only in California and maybe a little bit in Colorado, but nowhere else across the country, and certainly nowhere else outside of the United States. And so those were the interesting things that we were tracking in Trends. And again, it didn't have to just be consumer products. It was really just about finding the sentiment that was happening across the world, and kind of sharing that with people before they had heard of it or before the masses had heard of it. And so I would encourage people, that one of the most interesting things about today, 2023, or really the last few years, is we do have these tools, whether it's Google Trends, Ahrefs is another great tool, Subreddit Stats is another great tool, Jungle Scout, you can see different Amazon buying trends, and you can just get curious about the data that exists. Like 10 years ago, this data did not exist. You could not see what people were buying or searching or what topics, communities we're talking about. And so I would encourage people to, if we extrapolate past the like super obvious things that about, like AI is a huge topic right now that's in the news, do your own digging, right? Play around with these tools and see what pops up and see what garners your interest. And I think that's, again, like we're at actually a very unique inflection point where the data exists, but also at an inflection point where many people still do not play with the data or understand it or query it, get curious about it.
So you can find that granularity as if you're interested in becoming a content creator and starting to build your social media followings and whatnot, would be wise to pay attention to those trends that may help you get connected with those, I don't know, would you call them early adopters? But anyways, an audience that's looking for that content and searching out answers to those questions or opinions in the subreddits or some of the other resources you mentioned.
Yeah, and just on that note, one of the things that's so important about some of these tools is that they're not just tracking what people happen, or how should I say this? They're not just tracking new ideas and surfacing them to you. They are tracking vetted new ideas. And by vetted, I mean these tools are surfacing the most upvoted posts on subreddit, for example. They're surfacing the most popular products you've never heard of, but that are doing millions of dollars on Amazon each month, right? So I think there's that extra layer of, you can try to get fidelity by talking to your friends or seeing what ads are running on the TV shows that you watch. But that's not vetted data. That just happens to be the data that reaches you at a given time. But today we actually have tools that we can see what are the things that people are searching for the most in this week? What are the products that are surprisingly big, that are doing, again, much more revenue than you would expect? What niche communities are actually not that niche? What are these communities on subreddit, or what subreddits actually have millions of people interacting every single day on them that you would have thought was a tiny community? And then using these tools, you can actually see what are the things that those people care about the most? What was the most upvoted post of the week, of the year, etc. And so again, there's this, I think, overlooked or underappreciated nature of, like, this is vetted information. In fact, there are people, you're talking about newsletters, there are people who build entire followings on Twitter, for example, who will just use a tool like subreddit stats to find something that is already trending on Reddit, so it's already vetted, and then they'll just post it on Twitter, and they know it'll do well because they already know thousands or millions of people have said this is interesting, and they can even look in the comments of those posts and say, hey, this is what people are asking for. These are the aspects of this original post that people find most interesting. So I think that's actually, it sounds simplistic, but it's, people say that, like, there's opportunity everywhere, but it's not evenly distributed. In this case, it is actually evenly distributed because everyone has access to these tools. Most people just don't know how to use them, or they just don't think to use them.
Yeah, sort of ironically, back to the earlier part of our conversation, the answers are actually out there if you take the time to care to look. And a conversation with your neighbor about, hey, this is trending, isn't a vetted sample, to your point. It's one in a very vast sea, but the internet has it sounds like a very, I don't want to say democratized, but probably more efficient way of surfacing things that are validated and of interest to people.
No, absolutely. I mean, there are obviously extreme versions of this where there are companies that run satellites that look at, migration patterns and all that. And so that is data, for example, that is not democratized, but there's still a lot of open space that is democratized that people just don't really know. Again, they either don't know it exists, or they know it exists and they don't know how to use it.
Yeah. Next topic I'd like to chat with you, Steph, is in your journey of trying these different things, and sounds like you've traveled the world and been to many countries. Talk to us, because I know our listeners would be keen to hear about this. And in the programs we offer here at Queen's to support research, partnerships, and innovation, we're always talking about networking and finding mentors that can help you. That a conversation with the right person for 30 minutes can save you 6 months of desk research, for example. So talk to us about how that might have played a role in your career progression. And I know actually came across you when you were on the My First Millions podcast, and You certainly have those two hosts in your corner as champions. So talk to us about the importance of networking, mentorship, and just having those people that are your champions that will help you get to where you might want to go in your career.
Yeah. So I obviously Sam, especially from My First Million and who founded The Hustle, has been, I don't know if I think of him as a mentor, but he certainly has supported me throughout my career. And it's funny because we originally met through my writing. So I was writing these articles and several of them had gone viral and he had stumbled upon them. And I think by the, second or third that he ran into, he just kind of DM'd me on Twitter and said, hey, well, are you interested in working for The Hustle? We're building this thing called Trends. But what's interesting about, the most influential mentors or people who have been, I guess, people who have really helped guide me in my career, like Sam, is that they've all come from jobs that I've had. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think there's often this intuition for many people to be like, oh, there's this, someone like Paul Graham. How inspiring. How do I get Paul Graham to be my mentor? Well, guess what? There's like millions of people who want Paul Graham to be their mentor, myself included, right? Like I would love to have, one-on-one chats with him. But not only is it unlikely for someone like Paul to become a mentor of yours, he may not be the best mentor because he's never worked with you, right? He doesn't have the fidelity or the information. And I think it's very easy for us to overlook the folks who do have that information, that experience. And I think another related point is that a lot of people, I think, will choose jobs because they're like, oh, this one pays slightly better, or, this just happens to be the job that's on my doorstep. And I do think there is this mentality that is lost on many people, which again sounds simplistic, but it's really essential, which is every job that you take on, there should be something that you're extremely excited about, not only to pursue, but also to learn. And if you can find that, which I certainly found at The Hustle, where I was given this opportunity to build trends and really build up a product from the ground up that I was excited about and that I had a unique skill set to do, because I could do that, the reason Sam is in my corner is because I helped him build a great product. And we did it together and we had fun, and he could see my creativity and my skills, and I could in the same way with him. And so I think the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think maybe if I've seen so many people who are like, I spent 3 years at this company and they haven't really built a network there. They don't really have any mentors or people that they can lean on for their next, stepping stone. And maybe that's, a result or a function of the fact that they joined a company that they weren't really able to show the best side of themselves, if that makes sense. They weren't really able to grow into a position, and by nature of growing into a position, showing people what they're capable of so that they're capable of vouching for you, and they're also excited about vouching for you because they've seen your own growth. I don't know if that makes sense, but I actually think that's like a very underrated calculus that people don't make when they're choosing jobs. Just to add one final thing to that, my husband often says there's can't remember all of them, but when you join a job or you take on a new work, there's 5 different salaries, and the monetary salary is just one aspect of that. And there's many others, like your ability to be flexible, but also what are you going to learn in the role, like I just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's 100% on point. We often hear students, overhear discussions in the hallway, like I got this offer, that offer, and it's focused on the dollar amount. But boy, if you can find work that you find energizing every day, right, where you get up and go to work and it doesn't seem like work because you're doing things that satisfy your curiosity, or you get to work with great people, that's got to be a far better trajectory. And ultimately, probably financially, it could be in the long run, maybe not in the short term, but certainly in terms of getting up every day and working on things that are interesting. Here at Queen's, I've got one of the best jobs in the world because I get to see new inventions and help support new companies every day. It's just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine others that say, as you talked about earlier in the interview, as my path working at a consulting firm for 35 years, that didn't sound like that would get you up every day and be energized and ready to take on the day. It's also, I want to touch on another topic you mentioned. So the way you came across Sam Parr as and the Hustle was you actually had your writing out online, and
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess is that the power of SEO? Like just over time, people will come across your content and you're starting that interaction with probably something more in common, or at least shared philosophies. I don't know what it would be, but would you say that played a role? I mean, that almost seems like serendipity, but it's not if you're actually writing consistently and putting your thoughts out there and matching with like-minded individuals.
Yeah, so I should just quickly note that the articles that I wrote, while I have done a lot of work with SEO, I would say I always break down that with content, there's kind of like the content that people want, and that's the SEO bucket, because you can literally see it in the searches, in the search volume that's out there. But then there's this other bucket where you just have this intuition. You don't know that people want it because they're not searching for it, but you just have this inkling that this is going to resonate with people, that people are going to share it. My favorite example of this is there's one of the most upvoted posts on Hacker News of all time is from this guy, Peter. And I think the title is, I sell onions on the internet. And like, no one is searching for that, right? Billions of people on earth, like there's no one searching for like, how do you sell onions on the internet? But he had this inkling because he did sell onions on the internet, that he had just this like fascinating story. And so I should say that most of the articles that did connect me to people like Sam were these inklings. I do have written SEO driven content, but they were these ideas where I'm like, I just feel like people need to hear this, whether it's a story or this lesson. And coming back to your question about, you said, is it luck or is it something else? I do think that there is an underrated concept that if you do put yourself out there, whether it's through writing or videos or something else, then that content will work for you if it's good. If it really comes from a place where you're like, I have something to say, that content is almost like your brain being multiplied many, many times over. And while you're sleeping, if it's good, other people are sharing it for you. They're telling their friend about this article or this podcast they heard where you said this thing. And that's what those articles did, right? With Sam. And, Sam was one of many other people who ended up interfacing with that content. And to your point, because they've read this part of your brain that you've put on paper, when they actually approach you, it's not this cold outreach of, hey, like this person told me to talk to you. It's like, oh, I feel like I already know you. And you said you listened to My First Million. Like when people meet Sam and Sean, they feel like they truly know them because they've had them in their ear for an hour each episode, and they've listened to dozens of episodes. And so they probably do know them pretty well. In fact, I heard Tim Ferriss was on this show recently with Colin and Samir, and they were like, it's actually interesting when you think about it. The people who listen to Tim Ferriss spend more time with Tim Ferriss. It's a parasocial relationship, but they spend more time with Tim Ferriss than probably all their best friends and their family, right? Like in terms of the actual hours that he spent with Tim versus any other person. And so I do think that is where you get the most interesting opportunities and also the most interesting relationships that develop over time, because you can almost imagine, I said it's like putting your brain on a piece of paper, but it's also like duplicating a piece of your brain into a magnet that over time will attract certain magnets or vet other people for you. And they're simultaneously kind of vetting on their side as well. And I guess the final thing I'll say there, use the term serendipity. This guy, David Perel, actually, I don't know if he coined it or heard it from someone else, but he says writing is like increasing your surface area for serendipity. So there's still luck involved. It's not going to do all the work for you. But imagine that if you're like a small little cube, like 1 centimeter squared to start, as you write, imagine just building that up into like this larger igloo that over time you just have a just much greater area or surface area of serendipity. And over time it does become almost, to your point, like you're increasing your luck so much that it becomes inevitable.
Yeah, fascinating story. And thank you for differentiating the thought of putting your thoughts on paper and just leaving them out there versus the SEO, which is a different bucket. I'd gotten those two conflated. Thanks for sorting that
I
out.
think it's important to note that they also don't have to be completely separate. You can do both as well.
Yeah. Fair enough. So Steph, I wouldn't mind just chatting about a couple of things I've seen you do on your current hosting job. It sounds like you get to do some pretty fun things. I've seen in your Twitter feed you've talked to physicists, and you seem to be diving in. You just did a segment or a podcast on self-driving and things like that. Can you give us a couple of examples of the kind of things that you're going to be tackling or that you've done recently, just to give our audience a flavor of the kind of fun things you get to cover as part of your current job at Andreessen Horowitz?
Yeah. So our goal with the A16Z podcast is just to cover the most interesting topics and founders within technology, and to really showcase what they're building. And if we're doing our job right, then people should be a little surprised, kind of like my work at Trends, where they're like, oh, I kind of knew that AI was a thing, but I didn't realize these were the most important aspects of it. Or I kind of knew self-driving was on the horizon, but I thought it was 10 years away, not 2. So those are some examples. And lately, just to name a few of the things that we've released, as you said, this was probably my favorite project so far in the year I've been there. I got to ride in a Waymo with their chief product officer, and that was my first time in a self-driving car. And I actually didn't learn to drive until around a year ago. I just kept putting it off. And so for me, it was like, oh my gosh, how cool is it that this technology is here? Especially because I don't know if you think the same way, but most people, it feels like, have forgotten about it, right? There was all this hype maybe like 5-10 years ago, and now that it's finally here to a degree, it's like, crickets. Like no one's talking about it.
Yeah, I had forgotten until I started following some of your recent stories on it, that there are autonomous cars driving around in certain parts of the U.S. So yeah, it is. So is it a bit surreal sitting in a car without a driver? Like it's got to be a bit of an odd experience.
The first few seconds you are kind of like, wow, it's amazing that this wheel is turning by itself. But I've now taken probably like a dozen friends in these cars now. And it's amazing that with all of them, they very quickly forget. And I think that's a result of us having Ubers and Lyfts and ride sharing for a while, because we are kind of used to being driven around, and you kind of just forget that instead of a human sitting in the front, there's just, software running that computation. So yeah, it's exciting that that's coming around. But we're covering all types of stuff. Like you mentioned, got to talk to a Nobel Prize winning astrophysicist recently at the Ideas Festival. We're covering all types of topics like critical materials, like going into batteries, how do we upgrade the grid, lots in biotech. I think that's obviously an emerging space that is getting a lot of traction, especially with some of the advancements in AI. We recently did a series on AI hardware because there's this large GPU shortage that matters to what feels like just about every tech company, as every tech company is trying to integrate AI in some way. We are doing episodes, on like the future of jobs, like with the AI wave that's happening right now. What happens? There's a lot of fear, but I think there's actually, in the past, when technology has reshaped the job market, new jobs have appeared, and I think that'll be the case now as well. And so kind of showcasing what are some of the new opportunities that people should be learning, whether they're in college or otherwise. And so, yeah, those are, just a handful of the things that we're covering. But again, it's just really like if there's something interesting in technology that really matters to the wider world, then we're hoping to cover it.
Fascinating. Amazing to see those kind of trends up close and personal in real time. That's awesome. Steph, you've been very generous with your time. I wonder if I could ask you one last question.
Sure.
So Queen's University is in Kingston, Ontario. It's now a university town of 140,000 people, pretty close to your number of Twitter followers, which is kind of a mind-boggling thing to think about anyways, in some sense.
That is
but
mind-boggling.
We're in Canada, and the population of Canada is much smaller than the U.S. And I know you've moved your career down to the U.S. Could you give us any compare and contrast to innovation pathways that you've seen from where you sit as a creator or a writer or keynote speaker or any of the hats you've been wearing, to compare and contrast the difference between the U.S. and Canada, I guess with an eye towards things that we could be doing in Canada that could make Canada more like places like Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas, or some of the biotech hubs in San Francisco or Boston?
Yeah. So, I mean, I still love Canada, and I still feel very, well, I am Canadian at heart. Um, and I am excited and delighted really to see some of what feels like advancements in tech happening in Toronto. I think there are some pretty significant AI firms that have opened up offices there, and some founders coming from there as well. And so I think maybe something that I've noticed, especially moving to San Francisco recently, and of course there's some internal debates even within the city, but I think what I find very exhilarating is just getting to see kind of like the fringes of technology and truly being optimistic about that. Like I wish more people, not just within Canada, but around the world, would just kind of revel in the progress. Like that is, to me, it is so incredible what many people around the world are working towards, and to also just look back at like the progress we've made since I graduated college. Like, how long has it been? 8 years ago. It's amazing. Like, shouldn't we be excited that there are self-driving cars on the road? Shouldn't we be excited that we're making complete unlocks and like protein folding and that, what that can potentially lead to in terms of health outcomes? Like, this stuff is amazing, and I just wish this is not maybe a Canada specific thing, but I wish more people who are maybe a little tech apprehensive, even though that they have perhaps good reason to want to be careful, would just at least like embrace that there are things to be excited about. And that's also maybe some of the optimism, some of the excitement that we hope to bring with the A16Z podcast. But I think it's one of the reasons you end up with some of these tech hubs like San Francisco is that it does rub off on people, right? Like that energy is intoxicating. And I just wish we could share that, with more people, which is, again, in a way what we're trying to do with content.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree, Steph. We're editing genes that may eradicate disease. Yeah. We're sending rockets deep into space that can come back and land and be reused like almost a commercial airliner. It's just an amazing time to be around. Steph, wanted to thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with us. I suspect our listeners are going to be very interested to hear your story. And if you're ever back in Canada, please let us know if you stop by campus. We'd love to
I would love
have you
to
drop
come
in for a visit.
Sometime. Yeah, I would love that.